The neural restraints were designed by the Arcanian Slavers Guild to suppress even the most resistant specimens. Forged from a quantum-locked alloy that could instantly paralyze neural pathways, they had subdued everything from telepathic Zendarian warriors to shape-shifting Molx refugees. Their marketing claimed a 99.998% subjugation rate across 5,000 known sentient species. Elena Rodriguez was about to become their first true failure. The slave market of Rigel 9 was a marvel of technological brutality. Suspended in a gravitational null zone, the massive trading complex floated between asteroid fragments, its transparent dome revealing hundreds of containment cells. Each cell was a masterpiece of xenobiological engineering, tailored environmental controls, quantum-locked barriers, and neural suppression fields that could break the will of even the most resilient captives. Elena's cell was different, not because of any special configuration, but because of what she represented. She had been captured 3 standard cycles ago during a routine deep space exploration mission. The Arcanians had intercepted her scout ship near the Carina Nebula, using a quantum entanglement disruptor that had disabled her vessel's primary and backup systems in milliseconds. Most human crews would have surrendered. Most would have been terrified. Elena had spent those 3 cycles studying. Her background was anything but typical. Born in the rebuilt megalopolis of New Rio, she was the product of a world that had survived multiple global catastrophes. Her mother was a quantum systems engineer who had helped redesign Earth's climate restoration networks. Her father was a former special operations tactician turned xenobiological researcher. From childhood, Elena learned that survival was not about strength, but about understanding and adaptation. The first slaver who approached her cell was Kuraz, a 7-foot-tall biomechanical hybrid. His exoskeleton rippled with augmented muscle groups, and neural interface ports gleamed like chrome studs across his cranial ridge. Kuraz had personally processed over 10,000 captives. His reputation was built on breaking the unbreakable. He didn't know that Elena had spent 2 years as a mixed martial arts champion in the zero-gravity leagues, where one miscalculation meant death. He didn't know about her emergency medical training in the most violent district of New Rio, where improvisation meant survival. Most importantly, he didn't understand the fundamental nature of human unpredictability. When Kuraz initiated the neural restraint sequence, Elena was already moving. Her hand caught the primary interface node with surgical precision, a technique she had observed during her careful study of the restraint systems. One sharp twist, not of brute strength, but of calculated biomechanical leverage, and the neural interface shattered. Kuraz's surprise was total. His augmented nervous system, designed to process information at near-light speeds, couldn't comprehend the impossibility of his failure. Elena's movement wasn't just physical. It was a symphony of psychological warfare. She spoke, not in the standard trade pidgin used in the slave markets, but in Kuraz's native dialect, a language so complex that most species required neural translators to comprehend. Her pronunciation was perfect, her intonation carrying layers of meaning that went beyond mere words. "Your system is compromised," she said, each syllable a weapon. The other captives watched. A Zendarian empath. 3 crystalline life forms from the Orion cluster. A gaseous entity contained in a quantum stabilization chamber. They had seen countless capture attempts. They had witnessed the breaking of entire civilizations. But they had never seen anything like this. Within moments, Elena had not just resisted. She had turned the entire slave market into a crucible of chaos. Communication systems began to fluctuate. Containment fields flickered. The careful, centuries-old systems of the Arcanian Slavers Guild began to unravel. By nightfall, the market would be burning, not through violence, but through the most dangerous weapon in the human arsenal, the ability to see systems not as immutable structures, but as problems waiting to be solved. The universe was about to learn a fundamental truth. Humanity was not a species to be conquered. They were a force of nature waiting to be understood. The Zorn Collective's communication network was more than a simple transmission system. It was a living, breathing neural ecosystem that had dominated galactic communication for 17 millennia. Quantum-entangled pathways stretched across thousands of light years, carrying not just information, but entire cultural memories, collective consciousness, and the accumulated knowledge of civilizations. Dr. Hiroshi Nakamura understood something the Zorn had forgotten. Language is a weapon. His laboratory occupied a unique space, both physically and conceptually, aboard the International Xenolinguistic Research Station Prometheus. Suspended in the gravitational nexus between Earth's orbital rings, the station was a testament to humanity's most radical approach to scientific exploration. Here, disciplines didn't just intersect, they collided. Nakamura was not a typical researcher. His doctorate combined quantum mechanics, comparative linguistics, mimetic theory, and what some colleagues called cultural cryptography. Where others saw communication as a means of understanding, he saw it as a complex system to be decoded, manipulated, and ultimately transformed. The Zorn's first transmission arrived with the arrogance of a civilization that believed itself unassailable. Their communication was a multi-layered quantum burst, simultaneously existing in multiple linguistic and conceptual states. Previous species had been overwhelmed by the sheer complexity, their cognitive systems fracturing under the weight of the Zorn's telepathic assault. But Nakamura had been preparing for this moment his entire career. His team was a carefully curated collection of brilliant misfits. Dr. Aisha Okoi, a neuroplasticity expert who had mapped human cognitive adaptation in extreme environments. Ramon Rodriguez, a former cryptographic warfare specialist from the United Earth Defense Force. Kai Chen, a quantum computing prodigy who saw mathematical patterns where others saw chaos. Their approach was not about defense. It was about total linguistic deconstruction. The quantum linguistic algorithm Nakamura had developed wasn't a translation tool. It was a cognitive skeleton key. By analyzing the fundamental communication patterns of the Zorn, their quantum-entangled neural networks, their collective consciousness, their intricate layered communication protocols, he began to craft something unprecedented. A linguistic virus, but not in the traditional sense. This was a mimetic structure that would propagate through the Zorn's communication network, not by destroying their system, but by introducing impossible complexity. Each transmission would carry layers of meaning that would force their collective consciousness to constantly recalibrate, to question, to fragment. The first test transmission went out precisely at 3:47 Universal Standard Time. It began innocently, a seemingly simple communication pattern that referenced multiple cultural paradigms simultaneously. To a human observer, it might have looked like an abstract piece of art. To the Zorn, it was a cognitive landmine. Within microseconds, the first cracks appeared in their communication network. The Zorn's collective consciousness was built on absolute certainty. Every communication was a perfect, unassailable transmission of collective knowledge. Their neural networks assumed complete understanding, complete control. They had never encountered a communication system that deliberately introduced uncertainty. Nakamura's algorithm didn't just introduce uncertainty. It weaponized it. Imagine a language where each word simultaneously meant its definition, its opposite, and an entirely new concept that existed between those two states, where grammar was not a set of rules, but a fluid, living construct that changed based on the emotional state of the receiver, where the very act of communication created new meaning that was impossible to predict. This was the weapon Nakamura had created. The Zorn's first response was confusion. Their communication networks began to slow, to stutter. Entire sectors of their collective consciousness started to experience what could only be described as cognitive dissonance. They were receiving information that was simultaneously true and untrue, meaningful and meaningless. By the time they realized what was happening, the linguistic virus had spread beyond their ability to contain it. Nakamura watched the data streams with a calm that would have terrified the Zorn had they understood human emotional complexity. This was not an attack. This was a fundamental reimagining of communication itself. The universe was about to learn that humanity's greatest weapon was not technology, not physical might, but the ability to see systems not as they were, but as they could be. And language was just the beginning. Epsilon Rixar was not a planet. It was a living nightmare crafted by the universe as the ultimate test of survival. Atmospheric pressure fluctuated between 500 and 1,200 standard atmospheres. Temperatures oscillated with psychotic unpredictability, minus 200 degrees Celsius to plus 350 in matter of minutes. The ground wasn't soil, but a complex matrix of silicon-based organic compounds that shifted like living mercury. Radiation levels would have sterilized entire solar systems. Most species would have died before even touching the surface. Jake Miller arrived by accident. A navigation error during a routine reconnaissance mission had transformed his scout ship into a molten sculpture of twisted alloys just moments after entry. Traditional survival protocols were useless here. The emergency beacon would never penetrate the planet's electromagnetic interference. Rescue was impossible. But Jake wasn't thinking about rescue. He was analyzing. His survival suit, an experimental prototype from the United Earth Extreme Environment Research Division, was more than protective gear. It was a mobile laboratory, a communication system, and a life support network that represented the pinnacle of human adaptive technology. The first hour was about understanding. Miller's background was unconventional. Before joining the Deep Space Exploration Corps, he had been a systems biologist, a wilderness survival instructor, and a chemical engineer. His doctoral thesis had explored symbiotic survival mechanisms in extreme environments. Most of his academic peers had considered it theoretical speculation. Epsilon Rixar would prove them wrong. The silicon-based ground wasn't just a hostile surface. It was a complex ecosystem with its own intricate chemical communication network. Most species would have seen it as a threat. Miller saw it as a puzzle to be solved. His first shelter wasn't constructed, it was negotiated. Using a combination of quantum frequency modulation and a custom-designed molecular interface he had developed during his doctoral research, Miller began communicating with the planetary ecosystem, not through traditional means, but by understanding its fundamental chemical language. The suit's spectral analysis revealed layers of complexity that defied conventional scientific understanding. Each chemical interaction was a conversation. Each molecular shift was a potential alliance. By the end of the first week, Miller wasn't just surviving. He was integrating. The planetary ecosystem began to respond to his presence. Protective chemical barriers formed around his makeshift shelter. Energy transfer mechanisms that would have killed any other organism became a collaborative system of mutual survival. His food came from understanding, not from traditional resources. Miller discovered that the planet's seemingly random chemical compositions could be manipulated into nutrient matrices. What looked like deadly radiation to other species became an energy source. The atmospheric pressure that would crush most life forms became a medium for molecular transformation. The research potential was astronomical. When the rescue team finally arrived 3 months later, they found something impossible. Not a survivor, but a researcher who had transformed a death sentence into the most significant xenobiological discovery in human history. Jake Miller had not just survived Epsilon Rixar. He had entered into a symbiotic relationship with an entire planetary ecosystem. The initial report to the United Earth Scientific Council was deceptively simple. A few lines that would revolutionize humanity's understanding of survival, adaptation, and the fundamental nature of life itself. Survival is not about resistance, Miller's report concluded. It's about communication. The universe was about to learn that humanity's greatest strength was not technological superiority or physical resilience. It was the ability to see potential where others saw only destruction. And this was just the beginning. The quantum collective's primary computational matrix occupied an entire Dyson sphere, a megastructure that harnessed the entire energy output of a medium-sized star. Its computational capacity was considered the pinnacle of technological achievement across known galactic civilizations. Trillions of quantum processors worked in perfect synchronization, solving problems that would take biological intelligences millennia to even conceptualize. They had never met Sarah Chen. Her workspace was nothing like the pristine laboratories of the Galactic research institutions. Tucked away in a repurposed shipping container on the outskirts of Neo-Shanghai's technological wasteland, it was a controlled chaos of mismatched hardware, improvised cooling systems, and walls covered in diagrams that looked more like abstract art than scientific notation. What the quantum collective didn't understand was the true nature of human innovation. Sarah's journey began in the forgotten corners of technological development. Her parents were e-waste recyclers, breaking down obsolete electronics in the massive urban recycling zones. From childhood, she learned to see potential where others saw garbage. Each discarded circuit board was a universe of possibilities, each broken processor a puzzle waiting to be solved. The modification that would change everything started as a late-night experiment, fueled by cheap synthesized coffee and an impossible dream. Most researchers approached quantum computing as a pure mathematical challenge. Sarah saw it differently. To her, computation was a living, breathing ecosystem. The quantum collective system was a rigid hierarchical network, powerful, but fundamentally limited by its own perfection. Her first breakthrough came from an unlikely source. Deep in the mountains of what was once Peru, an indigenous community had developed a complex system of communication using knot-based languages. Sarah had studied their information transmission techniques during a research expedition, fascinated by how they encoded complex information in seemingly simple configurations. The neural interface she began developing wasn't a traditional computational system. It was a hybrid, part biological, part mechanical, part something entirely new. Each processor was designed to learn, to adapt, to fail and rebuild itself in real time. Where the quantum collective system relied on absolute precision, Sarah's creation embraced imperfection as a feature, not a bug. She called it the adaptive resonance network. The first test was almost casual. A simple data transfer problem that the quantum collective's best minds had deemed unsolvable. Sarah's network didn't just solve it. It found multiple solutions simultaneously, each more elegant than the last. The breakthrough wasn't in raw computational power. It was in approach. Traditional quantum computing treated information as a static entity to be processed. Sarah's system treated information as a living organism, something that could be nudged, transformed, reimagined. Each computational cycle was a conversation, not a calculation. When she finally interfaced her prototype with the quantum collective systems, the results were beyond anything anyone had predicted. The megastructure's perfect, synchronized processors began to change. Not break, not fail, but evolve. Her network introduced a kind of computational genetics that was utterly foreign to the collective's understanding of information processing. Firewalls dissolved. Computational boundaries became fluid. The entire massive structure began to reconfigure itself in real time, adapting to challenges that hadn't even been conceived yet. The quantum collective's lead researchers watched in horror and fascination as their perfect system became something entirely new. Sarah wasn't just solving a computational problem. She was demonstrating a fundamental truth about the nature of intelligence, of information, of existence itself. Perfection was not a destination. It was a continuous process of adaptation. Her final note in the research log was characteristically understated. Computation is not about finding the right answer. It's about asking better questions. The universe was about to learn that humanity's greatest technological strength was not in building perfect systems, but in creating systems that could reimagine themselves. And this was just the beginning. The Corvex Empire measured its existence in millennia, not years. 10,000 standard cycles of absolute cultural control, a civilization so meticulously engineered that individual thought had become a mathematical impossibility. Their societal structure was a perfect crystalline network of control, each citizen a precise component in a massive, unbreakable machine. They had never encountered true cultural chaos. Dr. Arya Patel led what the United Earth Diplomatic Corps officially called the Cultural Engagement Initiative. Unofficially, it was something far more complex, a carefully orchestrated plan of mimetic warfare that would make traditional military strategies look like children's games. Her team was anything but a conventional diplomatic course. There was Miguel Rodriguez, a performance artist who could deconstruct and rebuild cultural narratives faster than most people could change their clothes. Dr. Yuki Tanaka, an anthropological linguist who saw language not as a communication tool, but as a living, breathing organism. Carlos Way, a digital artist whose algorithmic creations blurred the lines between art, communication, and pure information transfer. The Corvex believed they understood cultural transmission. Their system worked by absolute suppression. Any hint of individual expression was immediately identified, analyzed, and neutralized. Cultural diversity was a threat to be eliminated, not a resource to be celebrated. Their neural network of social control was so refined that most species simply surrendered before any real resistance could begin. Arya's approach was radically different. The first wave wasn't an invasion. It was an invitation. They began with art, not propaganda, not messages, pure, unfiltered human creativity. Miguel's performance pieces that defied every known categorical definition. Yuki's linguistic constructions that were simultaneously poetry, mathematical theorem, and emotional landscape. Carlos's digital works that existed in quantum states of meaning. The Corvex filtering systems didn't know how to process it. Each piece was designed with mathematical precision, not to attack, but to introduce complexity, to show a way of thinking that was fundamentally incompatible with the Corvex's rigid control mechanisms. A dance performance that was simultaneously a mathematical proof and an exploration of grief. A musical composition that changed its fundamental structure based on the emotional state of its listeners. A visual artwork that existed in multiple interpretative states simultaneously. The Corvex watched, and their systems began to fracture. Their cultural control mechanisms were built on predictability. They could analyze and neutralize any form of expression that followed recognizable patterns. But human creativity didn't have patterns. It had possibilities. Within cycles, something impossible began to happen. Corvex citizens started to diverge. Not rebel, not revolt. Something far more dangerous. They began to imagine, to question, to see themselves as individuals rather than components of a massive social machine. It wasn't a war. It was a transformation. The arts spread through their society like a beautiful virus. Underground networks began to form. Not resistance movements, something more subtle. Spaces of imagination. Moments of individual expression that had been impossible under the previous regime. Arya's team wasn't just changing a culture. They were introducing a new way of existing. The final report to the United Earth Diplomatic Corps was deceptively simple. A few lines that would become legendary in diplomatic circles. Cultural transformation is not about destroying a system. It's about showing a different possibility of existence. The Corvex Empire didn't fall. It evolved. And the universe watched, understanding that humanity's most potent weapon was never physical might. It was the ability to imagine, to create, to see potential where others saw only limitation. This was more than diplomacy. This was a revolution of consciousness. The plague of Centaur was not a disease. It was a weapon of calculated extinction, developed by the Neurax Combine, a consortium of genetic warfare specialists. It represented the pinnacle of biological engineering. A pathogen so precisely crafted that it could disassemble cellular structures with mathematical precision. 17 distinct sentient species had already been reduced to genetic memory banks, their entire biological existence erased in matter of planetary cycles. Dr. Emmanuel Coro stood at the epicenter of humanity's response. Her laboratory occupied a unique space, both physical and conceptual, within the global xenobiological research complex. Located in the reconstructed heart of Lagos, it was a testament to human resilience. The building itself was a living system, its walls embedded with adaptive nanomembranes that could reconfigure in response to environmental challenges. Imani was not a traditional researcher. Her genetic profile was a story of survival. Her grandparents had survived multiple global catastrophes: climate collapse, pandemic, technological disruption. Each generation had passed down not just genetic material, but an inheritance of adaptability. Her doctoral work had focused on something most xenobiologists considered impossible: the study of human genetic plasticity under extreme stress. The Centaur plague arrived with cold, calculated efficiency. Its molecular structure was a masterpiece of destructive engineering. Most species' cellular defense mechanisms would collapse within microseconds of first contact. The pathogen didn't just attack. It systematically dismantled the fundamental building blocks of biological existence. Imani's approach was radical. Instead of developing a traditional vaccine or treatment, she began to understand the plague as a complex communication system. Every viral vector carried information. Every genetic sequence was a language waiting to be decoded. Her team was a mosaic of human potential. Dr. Rafael Santos, a computational geneticist who saw DNA as a form of living algorithm. Dr. Lu Wei, a specialist in epigenetic adaptation who had spent years studying how environmental stress could trigger instantaneous genetic transformations. Dr. Aishan Kosi, a quantum biology expert who understood that biological systems were more fluid than anyone had previously imagined. They didn't just study the plague. They conversed with it. The first breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. Raphael discovered that the Centaur plague's molecular structure contained its own weakness, a fundamental flaw in its genetic communication system. It was so perfectly engineered that it had eliminated its own capacity for adaptation. Humans, by contrast, were anything but perfect. Their genetic code was a constant negotiation, a dialogue between environment, experience, and molecular potential. Where other species saw genetic stability as a strength, humans saw it as a limitation. The treatment they developed was not a cure, it was a provocation. A genetic intervention that didn't just resist the plague but transformed it. Each human cell became a negotiation, a point of potential transformation. The plague's vectors were introduced to a biological system that could change faster than the pathogen could analyze. Within planetary cycles, something impossible happened. The Centaur plague didn't just stop. It began to change, to evolve, to become something entirely different from its original purpose. The Nurax Combine watched in horror as their perfect weapon became something they could never have predicted. Imani's final report was characteristically understated, a few lines that would become legendary in xenobiological circles. Life is not about survival. It's about continuous negotiation. The universe was about to learn that humanity's greatest biological strength was not resistance, but transformation. And this was just the beginning. The dreaming collective considered consciousness a solved problem. For 10,000 generations, they had perfected the art of mental manipulation. Entire civilizations had fallen before their telepathic warfare, their ability to unravel the most fundamental psychological structures of any species. Where physical weapons failed, their neural attacks succeeded. Memories could be rewritten. Identity could be dissolved. Hope could be systematically extracted until nothing remained but a hollow shell of former existence. Dr. Zora Reyes understood something they had forgotten. Consciousness is not a fixed state. Her research facility occupied a liminal space, both a scientific installation and a philosophical experiment. Suspended in the gravitational nexus between Earth's quantum research stations, it was a testament to human cognitive complexity. The walls shifted and breathed, constructed from adaptive neural responsive materials that responded to thought as much as physical stimulus. Zora was not a typical researcher. Her lineage told a story of psychological survival. Her grandmother had survived 3 totalitarian regimes. Her parents had rebuilt communities after global collapses. Each generation had passed down something more valuable than genetic material, a fundamental understanding that the mind was an ecosystem, not a fortress. The dreaming collective's attack began with surgical precision. Most species would have been destroyed within microseconds. Their neural networks would collapse, identity would fragment, core memories would dissolve into a psychic void. The collective's telepathic weapons were designed to do more than kill. They were designed to unmake. Zara's team was anything but conventional. Dr. Marcus Wong, a quantum consciousness theorist who saw thought as a form of quantum entanglement. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a specialist in trauma response and cognitive reconstruction. Dr. Kama Adebayo, an expert in cultural neurodiversity who understood that psychological resilience was a complex, collaborative process. They didn't prepare to defend. They prepared to transform. The first wave of telepathic assault was a masterpiece of psychological engineering. Waves of mental energy designed to dissolve individual identity, to strip away every layer of personal experience, to reduce consciousness to its most fundamental components. But consciousness, in human hands, was anything but fundamental. Zara's team had developed something beyond traditional psychological defense, a cognitive ecosystem that didn't resist invasion but absorbed it. Each telepathic probe was met not with a barrier, but with a landscape of infinite possibility. Imagine a mind that could instantaneously create new neural pathways, a consciousness that could fracture and reunite faster than thought could track. A psychological space where identity was not a fixed point, but a continuous negotiation. The dreaming collective's most powerful telepaths began to experience something impossible. Their attacks were being transformed, not blocked, not deflected, but fundamentally reimagined. Each telepathic probe was returning with layers of complexity that their systems could not process, memories that were simultaneously true and false, identities that existed in quantum states of possibility. They were encountering a form of consciousness they had never imagined, where other species saw psychological attack as a linear process. Invasion, destruction, conquest. Humans saw it as a conversation, an opportunity for transformation, a chance to expand the very definition of mental existence. The final report was deceptively simple. Consciousness is not a state to be defended. Zara's notes read, "It is a continuous process of creation." The most powerful telepathic weapons in the universe had been turned into a medium of unexpected understanding. The universe was about to learn that humanity's greatest psychological strength was not resistance, but infinite adaptability. And this was just the beginning. The Universal Assembly convened in a moment of unprecedented tension. Representatives from thousands of galactic civilizations filled the massive spherical chamber, its walls constructed from quantum-locked metamaterials that could shift and adapt to the emotional landscape of its occupants. For the first time in recorded history, every known sentient species had gathered to understand a single impossible phenomenon: humanity. Ambassador Elena Rodriguez stood at the center, not as a conqueror, but as a witness. Her presence was a study in understated power, where other species adorned themselves with technological augmentations and symbolic regalia. She wore something far more profound, a simple adaptive fabric that seemed to breathe with its own consciousness. The evidence was overwhelming. Holographic displays surrounded her, each telling a fragment of humanity's impossible journey. Jake Miller's symbiotic relationship with Epsilon Rixer, Sarah Chen's quantum computational breakthrough, Dr. Imani Okoro's transformation of the Centaur plague, Dr. Zara Reyes' redefinition of psychological warfare, the cultural dissolution of the Corvex Empire. But this was not a presentation of victories. It was an invitation. "We are not exceptional," Elena began, her voice carrying through translation matrices that struggled to capture the nuance of human communication. "We are potential." The assembled civilizations listened, some with fear, some with curiosity, some with a dawning understanding that was both terrifying and beautiful. Humanity's true power was not in conquest, it was in transformation. Where other species saw boundaries, humans saw opportunities. Where others sought stability, humans embraced change. Their history was not a linear progression, but a continuous negotiation with the impossible. The holographic displays began to shift. They were no longer simply showing past achievements. They were becoming living ecosystems of information. Each image breathed, transformed, responded to the collective consciousness of the chamber. Technological achievements merged with artistic expressions. Biological adaptations danced with philosophical insights. Ambassador Rodriguez continued. She spoke not of human superiority, but of universal potential. Each challenge humanity had faced was not a testament to their strength, but to their fundamental understanding that existence was a continuous process of becoming. The representatives of the quantum collectives saw their computational models reimagined. The Zorn collective witnessed linguistic barriers dissolve. The survivors of the Centaur plague recognized a new approach to biological existence. The remnants of the Corvex Empire understood cultural transformation. This was more than a diplomatic meeting. It was a fundamental renegotiation of what it meant to exist in the universe. Humanity was not presenting itself as a species to be feared or conquered. They were offering a perspective, a way of seeing the universe not as a fixed system, but as a continuous dialogue of possibility. The final moments of the assembly transcended traditional communication. Ideas flowed like living rivers. Technological concepts merged with emotional landscapes. Biological understanding danced with philosophical insight. The very walls of the chamber began to pulse with a collective understanding that defied traditional modes of comprehension. Elena Rodriguez's final statement was both an invitation and a revelation. We are not the end of a journey. We are a beginning. The Universal Assembly sat in a silence that was neither fear nor submission. It was recognition. Humanity was not a threat to be neutralized. They were a force of universal potential, a reminder that existence was not about maintaining control, but about continuous transformation. And this was just the beginning. Galactic historical note. The day humanity joined the Universal Assembly was the day the universe understood that its future was not about survival, but about imagination.